What's going on, everybody? Welcome to Stat Masters. I'm your host, Chris Buonagura, and today I'm going to take you on a journey through some of life's most difficult questions. Questions like, will Kadarius Toney reach his ceiling in Kansas City with Patrick Mahomes? Can I trust Rashod Bateman after a Liz Frank injury and a lot of failure over 3 years? Is Jameson Williams someone I can trust in fantasy football? The things that keep most sane people up at night. But before we answer your hard-hitting questions, we're going to come in easy with a player I really like who also has a lot of questions, Calvin Ridley. Ridley, Toney, Bateman, and Jameson Williams all have one thing in common. All four of these players have someone out there that's really hyping them up, and all four of them have missed significant time in the last year or two and have played very little football. So what do we do with them in best ball? How do we invest in these players? With Calvin Ridley, he's the easiest one to invest in because he has the most actual NFL pedigree that we can go off of. So we start at his cost, of course. Cost is king. And we look at Calvin Ridley in the Superflex draft on Underdog that recently finished. He was wide receiver 18 by ADP. I know at the big board before that, he was a little more like wide receiver 20, 21. And it will be interesting to see where he opens in Best Ball Mania 4, set to drop Saturday when the draft wraps up, I believe, or early next week. And I'm going to assume it's going to be around wide receiver 18. Could be a spot higher. We'll see. So assuming he's wide receiver 18, we look at Calvin Ridley, 6'1", 189, decent athletic measurables for a wide receiver. First round pick. Profile doesn't really matter for a 28-year-old receiver who's been in the NFL for years. We look at his stats. Rookie season, he was wide receiver 26 in PPR points per game with an improvement in his sophomore year to wide receiver 18. And then he had the breakout 2020 that everyone really loved, where he was wide receiver 4, followed by a partial 2021, a personal decision to step away from the game of football, and a year-long suspension for gambling while he was away from football. Now, he enters 2023 as essentially the number one receiver for a Trevor Lawrence-led Jacksonville offense. And back when he was an elite fantasy football receiver, he was the number 2 receiver for Matt Ryan, who was still a good quarterback at that time, in an electric Atlanta offense, which was one of the most fantasy-friendly offenses for years, with Matt Ryan, Julio Jones, and anyone else fortunate enough to be on the field with them. So 2019 was Julio Jones' last year as a top 5 receiver in points per game, and Calvin Ridley took an obvious backseat. He was number 34 in targets, only 17% target share, didn't see a lot of opportunity in terms of routes run. His air yards and air yard share weren't necessarily high, but they weren't off the board. A lot of it makes sense for a wide receiver 2 across of a Hall of Famer. Still had a really good average depth of target with 13.6. Still earned 20 deep targets on 93 targets. That's good. Didn't see a lot in the red zone. And then his efficiency doesn't really have anything to jump at except for maybe his expected points added, which was number 21. The rest is kind of just there. But then you look at the 2020 season where he's wide receiver 4. And that year, Julio Jones had missed, I believe, 6 or 7 games. He was very banged up. Calvin Ridley was the number 1 for a lot of games. Earns 143 targets with a 25.8% target share. Runs a lot of routes. 2,000 air yards, number 1 in the league that year. A 41.4% air yard share. 14.4 average depth of target. 40 deep targets. Right? Number 1, not a lot of yards after catch. Didn't have a lot of yards after catch the year prior. Not a yards after catch guy, but not everyone has to be yards after catch to be elite. We've seen it with Mike Evans. We've seen DK Metcalf be really good with it. 2 players that we looked at last week that we said were good players, but their cost is going to affect how much you like them in fantasy football. You look at the efficiency, yards per route run is really good. Average cushion is number 5. He had good targets, but he did a lot with it. Yards per target was good, number 20, not necessarily amazing. Yards per reception was number 19. He was playing well. His EPA was number 9, number 4 in best ball points added, number 9 in fantasy points per route run. A lot of good, clearly a very good player. Is he a top 5, a top 10 receiver? Probably not. There's certainly a lot of very talented guys, but this is a guy that's really good at football. Takes a year away, but comes out with a very honest letter, kind of explaining himself and letting the public know that he does have the intention of coming in and giving it his best. He's in a situation where he's probably the number 1 receiver in Jacksonville. We've looked at Christian Kirk in the past and saw that, he's a good player, but he's not a number 1. We all believe Trevor Lawrence is a very good quarterback, and this is a team that's probably going to be a lot better on offense than it is on defense in a very competitive AFC. It's not hard to see a scenario where Calvin Ridley can earn 130 targets or 140 targets. How efficient he'll be on them is in question, but if we look at 26, 18, and 4 in PPR points per game. Number 4 is probably a spike. He's maybe not that good. 26 was a rookie year. If we settle on 18, which is somewhere in the middle, or we even go somewhere in the middle of 18 and 4, that would give you wide receiver 10, wide receiver 11. He's currently wide receiver 18. I'd say he still has a pretty good chance of finishing as a WR1, even if it's back end. He could finish in the top 12 or maybe just outside of it. I think Calvin Ridley at cost is a very good buy. I'm not going out of my way to reach on him, given that there's still the risk of not playing for a year. But you should feel very comfortable with Ridley. You should be happy to stack him with Lawrence. And frankly, of the Jacksonville players, he's the one that you want. His presence makes Christian Kirk a little more risky. ETN, there's a lot of question marks around what he can do with the large workload. Zay Jones is obviously just a fringe player. And Evan Engram is a good tight end, but he's expensive now, where last year he was cheap. Ridley's probably my favorite player to draft on Jacksonville, despite the unknowns around him. Now, that changes when we look at our other unknown players. Toney is a player who we know very little about in the NFL. He's currently sitting at wide receiver 38, and Rashod Bateman is not too far behind at wide receiver 44. And in this contest, Jameson Williams was wide receiver 31. This was before the 6-game suspension that we know that he has. So starting with Toney. Toney is a player where we've essentially seen nothing in the NFL, but he was a first-round pick. He does have a good athletic profile for his size. And you go down and you look at his injury history, and it's just kind of weird. It's a dude who's just consistent hamstring strains. Now, people question if he was actually hurt with the Giants or just didn't want to play. But then he goes to Kansas City and gets hurt again. Ankle injuries, just injuries kind of all around keeping him off the field. There's no stats, no metrics to go on. He really hasn't done anything outside of a game or two. But PlayerProfiler, being the useful tool that it is, still has information to give you. If you look at his player bio, just a little written about kind of the history of this guy. It usually starts somewhere up here, and then you can read more and read about Toney. I didn't even know this until I looked at his profile. This was a dual sport athlete in high school who, when recruited to college, was recruited as a quarterback and told that regardless of if he is the starter or not, he will find the field. And that was true. He didn't start at quarterback, but they played him at receiver, and he was good in his senior year, or his last season at least. And then he comes to the Giants, and it's similar, at least when he is on the field. It's like, hey, we're going to get you the ball in situations you can succeed. For that one game that he was good, goes to Kansas City, has a few plays. So when you look at Toney, it's a player that we would expect to have flashes of big play upside. I don't think it's realistic to expect him to be a target hog or a high volume player. You're not going to really want to hang your hat on a guy we've seen nothing for, but there is still that hope and chance that even if Kansas City adds more receivers, they find ways to pepper him in as someone who's always been an explosive athlete and at least found his way to the NFL. At his cost, I don't know how comfortable I am making that type of investment for a player in the top 40 receivers. And this is Superflex. In a non-Superflex league, he's well inside the top 100, around 80 or so. It's a hard bet to make with the exception of stacking. So for Toney, I would say that if you have Patrick Mahomes on your team already, that is when you go and you do a Toney stack, and you don't reach for it. You take it if he's there at ADP or post ADP. You don't take him around ahead of ADP just because you have other Kansas City players. If you're going to take Patrick Mahomes 10 or 11% of the time, which is healthy exposure, probably half of those teams you want Toney, which would be 5 or 6%. Because even if Toney does well, let's say best case scenario for Toney, he scores 170 fantasy points this year, which would be absolutely absurd for a guy who's never done anything to do. And let's say he's an 8th round pick, which he was for the big board, which was Superflex. Even if he does that, you don't necessarily need him on your team to have won. He's not necessarily the guy that wins you $1 million, and there's plenty of ways to do it without him in the 8th round. So he really only helps you when you can stack it with the quarterback. When you have the quarterback receiver stack, his spike weeks become even more valuable. But if you don't have the quarterback, his spike weeks are the same as anyone else's spike weeks. And it's a very slim chance that Toney is a guy that has a high advance rate and is a league winner when he's so fringe. I don't think a lot of people would argue that. The one people are going to argue is Bateman, who I would make the same argument for. I would say that you really only want to take Bateman in teams where you've drafted Lamar Jackson. To take Bateman anywhere except for stacked with Jackson doesn't really make sense. You don't necessarily need him. The chances he's a league winner are very slim at this point, and people are going to fight back. Most people at this point are looking at his prospect profile. So let's look at his prospect profile. He's 6 foot 190, good enough athleticism. It's not great, but for receiver, it's not as meaningful. He was a first round pick, which is really good. 83rd percentile college dominator, 98th percentile college target share, 93rd percentile breakout age with a 77th percentile college yards per reception is really good. That's everything you do want to see when you're looking at those stats, especially the young breakout age. He goes to Minnesota. He had the good sophomore year, the high target shares. I would have to check if it's a big school or not, but everyone really likes what he did in college. He does have efficiency and size. It's definitely a profile to like, but at what point do we discount the profile? I mean, this is now a player who's been in the NFL for 2 years, 2 partial seasons. And in the flashes of him playing, I didn't see enough to forgive so much missed time. And you also look at how he missed that time. He had a Liz Frank injury, week 8 of 2022. That's a really hard injury for players to come back from and still be explosive and really good. It's harder for running backs, but it's hard for any position. Now, Deebo Samuel did it, but his wasn't really a Liz Frank injury. It was more of a broken foot. That's a kind of a brutal injury on top of a series of soft tissue injuries. And then you look at what he did his rookie year, and it's nice, but it's not jaw-dropping. 15% target share is not great, even on a Ravens offense that doesn't throw a lot. Not running a ton of routes, not participating in routes, not really good air yards, poor average depth of target, and Lamar is willing to throw the ball deep. He did it for Marquise Brown. Not a lot of deep targets, only 7 deep targets. Granted, it's 67 targets. That's okay. The receiving yards is okay. Yards after the catch is poor. Nothing in the efficiency metrics. It's not as impressive as you would like it to be. Now, it was enough to invest in him last year at his cost with the profile. But we've now seen a second year with 2022 where you look at the game log, and I mean, he's not getting high snap shares. He's not running a ton of routes, or at least his route rate isn't above 75%. He arguably wasn't even out-snapping Devin Duvernay. Now, Devin Duvernay did fall off as the season went on, and chances are, had he stayed healthy, Bateman would have started to do so, but we saw very little. Lamar did start to get hurt, but a lot of people are hanging their hat on this 7 target, 4 receptions, 100 receiving yards game where he found the end zone. And it's nice. He's certainly a nice player, but it's 2 years of very little. You're coming off a brutal foot injury in what's inherently a low passing volume offense. I understand the hype. You can certainly still draft him. He's a little pricey, though, for what you're going to get out of him as wide receiver 44. He fell. He opened up in big board as a higher receiver. So if he does keep falling, he does get more valuable. But again, for this type of fringe profile, I'm going to stick with stacking him with Jackson. And that's really the only time where you're going to get the most out of him. The chances that as a standalone player, he provides so much value that you absolutely had to draft him is very slim, even when players hit in this range. So I would much rather the stack. I would rather take guys who are less injured with equally as high upside, a guy like Dotson, right? Even though arguably he's going to have a worse quarterback. So not huge on Bateman, not huge on Toney, but they're appropriate players to stack with because of the idea of their explosive upside. So now that leaves us with Jameson Williams, who, again, we've seen nothing. It's a player who came in off of an ACL, and then when he was finally on the field, just didn't get the ball. He didn't even get targeted. You look at his game log, I mean, minimal. He has 1 catch in the NFL. Now, it was a beautiful catch. We'll all watch that highlight for years to come and wonder what could have been. But 1 catch, I'll give him a pass. That coming off an ACL is hard for receivers, and he wasn't even a year off. I mean, they just said, hey, you can run, get on the field. So you can give him a pass. You look at the prospect profile, very fast. 6'1", 180 with the 99th percentile 40-yard dash is very good. The 19.9 college yards per reception with the speed is very good. The breakout age is good enough at 20.4. You would like it to be higher, but it's good enough. And he was an early first-round pick. The Lions are obviously invested in this player. I can understand liking him. You look at his college stats. He certainly put up in his junior season at Alabama. That's really good to see with the 20% target share and special teams work. It's a profile to really like. But to see so little in 6 games, even off the injury, is a red flag for sure. And to have so much commitment to take him as wide receiver 31 was obviously a bad idea. He will fall now, though. Now that he has a 6-game suspension, people will drop him. So the question is, how far? Do we want to take him where Toney is? If he falls to wide receiver 40, I probably still don't. Do we want to take him where Bateman is at wide receiver 44? It's still questionable because I would say Bateman at least has some work in the NFL. You could invest in rookie receivers like Addison or Flowers. You have a guy like Elijah Moore who might reclaim his career. It's going to be a question of how far does he fall? Would I take a shot on him before Juju, who's a very boring player? Probably, right? But I'm not going to go crazy on him. Again, I would prefer to stack him with Jared Goff. It's going to be a matter of where does his price fall, but chances are it's not going to fall far enough. You're now not going to get him for 6 games. So he's now not going to be a player that helps you advance. He's going to have to be a player to help you win in those, lottery one-off weeks during the playoffs. But that's a lot of risk for a sophomore player who is essentially in a de facto rookie season with a fringier profile that because it has the ACL and 1 catch in 6 games. And a lot of people like to say, he's the next Tyreek Hill. That's a really, really bold assumption to make. Tyreek Hill is one of a kind. At best, you would want to hope that he could be Marquise Brown or Henry Ruggs. I think people forget Henry Ruggs was quietly a very good player who did well down the field, but was also versatile in short yardage area when needed. Marquise Brown's the same way, but these guys were not Tyreek Hill, but they were very good and they were both first-round picks, similar to Jameson Williams. There's a lot of similarities here. He might be a little faster than those guys, but Ruggs was certainly fast. You look at Marquise Brown's fantasy points, he was hurt last year, 180 total on Underdog 2 years ago, 122 last year in limited games. So assuming Jameson Williams is peak Marquise Brown and he gets you 180 fantasy points, that's fine as wide receiver 31, but the bet you're taking there is such a fringe bet. If this was poker, you're going all in before the flop with a 2-6 unsuited. Technically, you could flop a full house and get a 6-6-2, but you're really going to go all in. It's not a good bet. He's going to have to fall drastically to warrant being drafted now, and we're going to have to see what happens with the free fall. Life's greatest questions that keep you up at night actually aren't all that interesting. It turns out the answer more often than not is just fade this extreme level of uncertainty despite the promise of flashy upside, with the exception of a guy like Calvin Ridley, who we actually know for certain is really good and is probably underpriced for his ceiling. And there's no question of situation. He's tethered to a fantastic quarterback and a team that has a lot of consistency right now, where Toney, a lot can change. Bateman, we don't know who his quarterback is. We don't know how healthy his foot is. And Jameson Williams has Jared Goff and the Lions. And even though the Lions have a lot of hype, it's the Lions. Let's be honest. That'll do it. If anyone wants to hear more, we are live Wednesdays at 8 on Discord. Normally, I have Aaron, the salary captain Stewart, with me, but today he was unavailable. He is going to the NFL draft with the Underworld to represent fantasy football's best live right in the fray. So you just get me tonight, and you get to ponder some of the existential dread that comes with fantasy football. And that'll do it. Thank you, guys.
Hey, you like that video? Be sure to subscribe and activate those alerts so you get notified as soon as new videos drop. And be sure to check out PlayerProfiler.com. We have all the tools for you to dominate every type of fantasy league. We have a draft kit, Dynasty Deluxe, data analysis, DFS Dominator, and don't forget the player rankings to rule them all.